In this video, we're going to look at the vector drawing tools over here in the Tools palette. These appear when you have a vector layer selected in the Layers palette. You might be familiar with vector tools from other programs like Adobe Illustrator or Animate, but the tools here in Moho work a little differently, so let's look more closely. This tool here is the freehand drawing tool. We're going to be taking a special look at this in a separate video along with a couple other features. For now, let's run through everything else. Before we start, it's important to note that before you start drawing, you want to make sure that the playhead of your timeline is on frame 0. It's best practice in Moho to do all your art creation and character rigging and scene setup on frame 0. Let's start really basic with the Shape tool. Up here you have the options for the tool. Let's just do a simple rectangle for now. Also keep an eye on the messages under here for modifier keys that let you do special things with a particular tool. One thing to note right away is you can use this setting down here below your stage to turn on and off the visibility of the actual vector points and the vector path that defines the shape. I'll just leave this on so you can see better how these tools work. It's set to automatically give whatever we draw a stroke or outline, and automatically give it a fill color, assuming it's a closed shape. You can uncheck these to get just a stroke or just a fill. The colors for these are controlled over here in the Style palette, and you also control the width of the stroke here. If you want to modify these for a shape you've already drawn, you need to use the Select Shape tool to select whatever you want to change and then adjust the style settings. Also, if you have multiple shapes overlapping, you can use the Select Shape tool and then use the up and down arrow keys to change the layering of the different shapes. There's more you can do to style a shape, but we'll look at the Style palette in a separate video. Now, if you want to delete a shape, you actually don't want to use the Select Shape tool. You want to use the Transform Points tool. This will actually select the vector points that make up the shape, and then you can hit delete to delete them. More on this tool in a second. So let's say we want our shape to have a stroke, but we don't want the stroke to be a uniform thickness. We can control that using the Line Width tool. Then hold Command or Control to get the Selection tool. And then you can select the points that make up the shape and just click and drag horizontally to increase or decrease the width of the stroke. This lets you create a custom width at different points of the shape. You can select single points or multiple points and control them simultaneously. Notice up top that this change is indicated as a %. So if we wanted the stroke back to normal, we could just select all the points and set them to 100%. Then the width is back to whatever it is in the Style palette. One last thing, if you put the Line Width tool in magnet mode here, it will snap to whichever point is closest. And you control the range of the snapping effect with the magnet radius. Okay, now let's look at how we can create more complex shapes. The first thing we can do is use the Transform Points tool. This does a few things. First of all, it lets you click on shapes to move, scale, and rotate them. Or you can flip the points of the shape horizontally or vertically with these buttons. You can also click on individual points and move them. Or you can hold Command or Control to make a selection of points and move, scale, or rotate just those points. Also, if you have a shape with curves instead of sharp corners, you can use this option up here to enable and disable what are called Bezier handles. These let you more precisely change the shape of a curve. Also, if you hold Alt, you can break the handle and create a sharper turn. This other toggle here changes whether the Bezier handles are fixed or not. When this is on and you click a point to move it, only it moves. But if that's off and you move a point, the adjacent curve will flex along with it. This could be useful if you're trying to more naturally reshape something during an animation. And if you have a shape with a sharp corner and you want to make them curved, you would use the Curvature tool. You select a point and then click and drag to increase or decrease its curvature. and you can see it gets Bezier handles then. And you can also hold Alt to get a selection tool to select multiple points and change all their curvature at the same time. Then you can customize from there using the Bezier handles. And up here, you can switch points from curves to corners if you need to. So that's how you modify existing points, but what if you don't have enough control points? First of all, if you know you need a lot more control points, you can use the Select tool to select points on our shape. And then this Split button up here will add additional points halfway between the points you have selected. But if you want to manually add points in specific spots, you can use the Add Point tool and click to add points to a shape. Just be aware of whether you want to add a sharp corner or not. And you probably want your Bezier curves locked. Otherwise, adding a point will change the existing curve. You can also use the Add Points tool to draw a shape from scratch. Before we try that, make sure Auto Fill, Auto Stroke, and Auto Weld are checked. You'll see why in a second. And you can choose whether you want to draw with sharp corners or not. I'll draw with curved points. Then you can click and drag to draw a stroke. Then click the endpoint and drag again to make another segment. We can keep going and come back around to the start. And because we have the Auto Weld setting turned on, it will automatically close the shape and add the stroke and fill. If Auto Weld was off and you tried to draw a shape, it wouldn't close automatically. You could weld points manually by using the Transform Points tool. Drag the endpoint over the other and press Enter. Lastly, you can also use this tool to subdivide a shape or add interior lines. However, notice these paths don't actually have a stroke yet. So we need to use the Paint Bucket tool, set it to Add Stroke, and then it will add a stroke to those paths. So with a combination of all the tools we've looked at, you can make any shape very precisely. But what we haven't looked at yet is how to make a shape with a hole in it. Like say we wanted to make a donut shape. Let's start by drawing two circles. I'll hold Alt to expand it out from the center point and hold Shift to make it a perfect circle. So now I have two separate circle shapes, but that's not what I want. I just want to use these two circle paths on their own. So what I'll do is use the Delete Shape tool. And now I'm left with just raw paths, and we'll turn them into a new shape. I'm going to the Paint Bucket tool. We can use this to add a stroke or fill or both. I'll do both. And then click in this space here, and now we have a donut shape. So using that same technique, you could make a hole of any shape within another shape. The last tool for making a shape is the Blob brush, which just lets you paint an area, and that area will become a shape. So we've looked at various ways of making shapes. Next, let's look at the other tools we have for modifying our shapes. I'm going to draw a grid with the Shape tool so you can clearly see what these tools do. We've already looked at the main Transform Points tool for moving, scaling, and rotating, but down here we have some more. This is the Perspective tool. You click and drag to make it look like a shape has turned in perspective, either horizontally or vertically. And remember, for each of these, they work on a sub-selection of points as well as whole shapes. Next is the Shear tool, which lets you skew or tilt a shape. Then there's the Bend tool, which lets you bend a shape around a central point. Then there's the Magnet tool. This is a more organic way to distort a shape. When I click and drag, it pulls on the points within the radius of the magnet. The points nearer the center get pulled harder than those towards the edge. So assuming you have enough points on your shape, this gives a sense of stretching something soft. This can be useful when we get into animating shape changes later. Then, last on the bottom row is the Noise tool. This lets you add irregularities to a shape to make it more organic and less geometric. Let's say we wanted to make a ground plane. I'll make it a rectangle. Then select the top and use Split to add some extra points. Then select everything and use the noise tool to randomly offset the points. And then I'll use the curvature tool to round those. And there we've got a nice organic ground plane. Next, let's take a look at the Curve Profile tool. This one's pretty cool, but it's not at all obvious what it's for or how it works. The best way to explain is to show you. So I'll make a shape, then I'm going to make another path that will apply along the curve around the shape. It's best to do this on a separate layer, so I'll make a new vector layer and call it Curve Profile, so I don't get them mixed up. Then I'll use the Add Point tool to just make an invisible path. Then back to the original shape, I'll select it and grab the Curve Profile tool, and then select the curve we drew, and it gets applied all along the outline for the shape. And the connection is still live, so we can go to our Curve Profile layer and edit it, and the shape around our path gets changed as well. And if we select the main shape and go back to the Profile tool, we can adjust how often the profile gets repeated along the edge. So that's what that tool is for. Now let's look at a couple tools that you might use for a similar purpose. So here I have a face with the nose as a separate shape on its own layer, and suppose I don't want this line on the outside edge where it's supposed to be connected to the face. There are a couple tools that will help us get rid of it. I can use this tool, the Hide Edge tool. Now don't confuse this with the Delete Edge tool. The Delete Edge tool will actually remove the edge, making the shape open, so you'll lose your fill. The Hide Edge tool just hides the stroke between 2 points, so you'll still keep the fill. Now there's another way to do a similar thing that gives you a little more control. We can use the Stroke Exposure tool. If we click and drag, it changes where the stroke edge ends. You may need to edit the values up top to also change the start percentage so your stroke starts and ends in the right place. This has the advantage of not needing to end or start at a control point. And this is something that can be animated on the timeline. So say I have animated the head turning. I can animate the stroke exposure over the course of the turn so it shifts from one side of the nose to the other. Lastly, I wanted to end by looking closely at the Selection tool. I've been using this casually, but here are some important features to know that it has. First of all, by default, the Selection tool uses a rectangular marquee selection, but you can also set it to lasso mode to make it easier to select specific points without selecting others. Then we already saw that you can use the split button up here to add additional control points between the ones that you've selected. Next to that, we have the opposite, which is simplify. If you have a shape that's made up of more points than is really needed, you can try to use this feature to reduce them. Just be aware this might change the shape slightly. You need to enter a value here for how aggressive you want the reduction to be. Higher value will remove more points, but change the shape more. Let's try 20. Then select what it is you want to simplify, and the button is now active. So we click that, and it reduces our points. Next, there's the Weld Crossings option. If you have two shapes overlapping, select them and hit Weld Crossings. It will add welded control points at the intersections. Note that these are still separate shapes. I can select them separately and move them separately. They'll just weld together at those specific points. And then lastly, we'll end on one of the coolest and most unique features of the selection tool in Moho, and that's the ability to save a particular selection of points. So say we have this head here, and we know we're going to want to move the jaw up and down over the course of the animation. I can make a selection of the points for the chin, and then up here I give it the name Chin and click Create. Now, if I ever want to make that selection again, I can just select it from the Select Group dropdown. And that appears when you're using the other transform tools as well. That can be super useful later when we get into animation and rigging. So that's everything in the vector drawing tools except for the freehand drawing tool. We're going to look at that on its own in the next video. I'll see you there.